Coming up on Cannabis Coast to Coast News with Alaina Pinto this week, all quiet on the federal reform of cannabis front, and the president ignores it completely in his congressional address despite the presence of recently released Russian prisoner Mark Fogel in the audience. We talk with the political director of NORML, Morgan Fox, in Washington, D.C.
I think that this is kind of the battle that we're looking at going forward, that if we do not raise the priority of this issue, it's not really going to get addressed in the near future.
Plus, democracy under attack as Idaho legislators are looking to block any future ballot questions regarding cannabis policy in that state. And in Ohio, the House of Representatives there proposes a second bill to amend the ballot-approved cannabis market with a less worse bill than what the state Senate proposed last week. Plus, in Texas, a judge stops their attorney general from overturning the already passed ballot initiatives by voters that decriminalize cannabis possession in many cities in that state, including Dallas. All that, plus more state reports and international news, including the arrest of a beloved caregiver in New Zealand, sparking protests in that medically approved nation. Cannabis Coast to Coast News with Alaina Pinto is next.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to Cannabis Coast to Coast News, PCM TV's weekly roundup of the cannabis industry from coast to coast and internationally. I'm Alaina Pinto. I am not going to remind you again about our app. Actually, yes, I am. You can scan the QR code and connect with the App Store or Google Play to download it. The app is where you will find our most viewed interviews, talk shows, news shows all over the past 4 years. And over those years, there was a lot of hope and talk about the green rush as a dozen states opened up adult use markets. But now with the change in administration, there is no mention of federal cannabis reform. Case in point, President Trump's 90-minute address to a joint session of Congress this week and never mentioned the word hemp, cannabis, or marijuana. Though he did point out the prisoner he got released out of Russia, the teacher Mark Fogel, had been wrongfully detained in a Russian prison for years for getting busted for medically prescribed cannabis. Making federal cannabis a priority is a huge challenge for all DC lobbyists. And Morgan Fox is the political director for the National Organization for the Reform of Marijuana Laws, or NORML. And he had his monthly talk with our executive producer, Jimmy Young.
Thanks, Alaina. Appreciate it. I'm Jimmy Young, the founder of PCM TV, and I'm so happy to be joined by a friend in Washington, D.C. His name is Morgan Fox, and he is with the National Organization for the Reform of Marijuana Laws, which has taken on a completely different challenge over the last few months, let's just say. Morgan, thanks again for joining us, because I always do enjoy chatting with you about all sorts of things.
Thanks for having me, as always, Jimmy.
All right, so the last time we spoke, you talked about the challenges of making federal cannabis reform a reality in a Republican-controlled environment. How's that going?
Well, right now, there's not a whole lot going on at the federal level. And this goes back to something that we've talked about on a number of different sessions about the priorities. And obviously right now, Congress and the White House have a lot of priorities that are way ahead of the list in terms of when they're going to get to them than cannabis policy reform. And I think that this is kind of the battle that we're looking at going forward, that if we do not raise the priority of this issue, it's not really going to get addressed in the near future. So definitely want to talk to you a lot more about exactly how that looks and what it's looking like. But so far, we've only seen a handful of bills be introduced at the federal level. We've seen a Veterans Access bill be introduced, and we have seen a bill that would prevent businesses from being able to get 280E relief, even if cannabis is rescheduled. So a little bit of a mixed bag.
And on top of all that, you now have Terrence Cole in charge of the DEA, a devout prohibitionist. Is the rescheduling movement completely done? Is it going to stay at Schedule 1? I know that you can't answer that question right now, but it sure seems like the goal is to keep it where it is.
Well, I think that was always the DEA's goal, under Milgram, and I'm assuming under Cole. Um Once Judge Mulrooney uh, halted the proceedings for fairly legitimate reasons. There was clear evidence of collusion between DEA management and opponents of the proposed rule, most namely groups like Project Sam and others. Uh, and there was certainly a questionable process when it came to choosing who the witnesses would be for the hearings. So, I mean, these were definitely things that were problematic and should have been brought to light. Um, Unfortunately, it did result in the proceedings being delayed, and now the ball is entirely in DEA's court under a potentially even worse DEA administrator under Terry Cole than we had with Ann Milgram. This is a guy that still believes in the gateway theory, that has tried to tie cannabis use to mass shootings, completely unscientific, and has been a lifelong drug warrior. So he has no interest in resuming the proceedings. He has no incentive to do so unless he starts getting some heat from on high.
That entire interview will be posted on our website, procannabismedia.com, plus the PCM TV app. Well, how quiet is it in Washington, D.C.? A report surfaced from an anonymous source in the White House who supposedly asks a former aide if the White House will listen to ideas on federal regulation. But that's not considered real progress. So only time will tell. But making reform a priority for the Republican controlled government is buried behind federal layoffs, new tariffs, and what to do about illegal immigration. Oh, and there are still two wars going on in the Middle East and Ukraine. Another distraction from cannabis actually happened in the district where law enforcement shut down 25 illegal operators and confiscated their inventory. Some of those shops are coming into compliance now with the existing district cannabis laws. With more from the nation's capital, here's Andrew Behringer.
I'm Andrew Behringer with the Washington, D.C. report for Cannabis Coast to Coast News. Washington, D.C. officials are reporting progress in their campaign against unlicensed cannabis retailers. Authorities announced that they have shut down 25 illegal gifting stores over the past 6 months. This crackdown follows new enforcement powers granted to the district's Alcohol, Beverage, and Cannabis Authority in 2024. Now, during the first 2 months of this year alone, 38 retailers either obtained proper licenses or ceased operations entirely. Particularly concerning, officials say some confiscated products tested positive for dangerous substances including amphetamines and psilocybin. Despite these enforcement efforts, authorities acknowledge that approximately 100 illicit cannabis shops continue operating across this district. The situation highlights a persistent regulatory challenge in D.C., where adult cannabis possession and use are legal, but congressional restrictions have prevented adult use sales. As of January, only 12 legal medical cannabis dispensaries serve the entire district. In other federal news, the cannabis industry is bracing for impact as President Trump's new tariffs take effect nationwide. With numerous critical supplies now facing steep import taxes, such as vape products are expected to be hit the hardest, as most hardware comes directly from China. Companies are already relocating production to countries like Malaysia to avoid the 20% tax. Packaging materials predominantly sourced from China will also see price hikes. Fertilizers and equipment like LED lighting systems are expected to become more expensive. Meanwhile, the booming cannabis beverage sector faces a double hit, with a 25% tariff on Canadian aluminum affecting canned products. For an industry already operating on thin margins due to heavy regulations and taxes, these tariffs represent yet another financial hurdle. Analysts predict consumers will ultimately bear these costs at the register, potentially pushing customers back to the unregulated market. Well, that's the Washington, D.C. report. I'm Andrew Behringer, reporting for Cannabis Coast to Coast News.
Now let's take a look at some of the state reports, and there's a disturbing trend in many legal states whose leadership wants to increase taxes on cannabis to help make up for budget shortfalls in California, Ohio, Michigan, New York, And in Idaho, the state legislature there is trying to pass an amendment to their constitution that would eliminate the right for ballot questions on cannabis. In Ohio, last week, the state Senate introduced a bill that completely changes the existing laws and regulations that were voted into law. Legislators there insulted the populace who passed that law by claiming the question was poorly written and voters were confused. Now the House is introducing a counter bill, and one of those Ohio voters is Christina Brisson, who has more from the Buckeye State.
Hi, I'm Christina Brisson with Over the Top Renovations, coming to you today from the Capitol here in Columbus, Ohio, with your weekly Ohio Cannabis Report with Cannabis Coast to Coast News. Last week we talked about Senate Bill 56 being passed and then moving to the House. Well, now the House has introduced a rival bill, HB 160, where it does keep a few things more in line for voters, where it does allow us the same number of plants that we're allowed to grow at home. It unfortunately does reduce the THC percentage from 90% to 70%, but does not limit the number of milligrams allowed in prepackaged items, allows us to smoke in more places like our own front porch, and unfortunately the taxes still land in the general fund. But overall, this more supports what the voters originally passed last year. But I don't want to end it on just a sour note. I also want to end it on something fun. Stargazer Festival with Cleveland Weed Company Weeding Out is going to be offering the Dream Cannabis Giveaway, where you can have your wedding officiated by rapper Afroman and have a Jamaican honeymoon. Check it out. Check out the festival. And good luck, Ohio. I plan to join that one myself. I am Christina Brisson with your weekly Ohio Cannabis Report with Cannabis Coast to Coast News.
Another state that continues to pit their government leaders against the will of the people is in Texas. The governor, Greg Abbott, Attorney General Ken Paxton, and now the Lieutenant Governor, Dan Patrick, all are trying to ban all products with THC in them for adult use. Over the past 3 years, 9 cities, led by Austin and Dallas, have voted to decriminalize cannabis by ballot question. This week, you probably won't find any of the Texas governmental leaders at the South by Southwest Cannabis Expo. The show has celebrated lifestyle and arts in the Lone Star, state capital of Austin, since 1987. This event features musicians, cannabis advocates, and old friends Liz Grow and Patrick Pope from Grow House Media.
Some of our greatest supporters are in Texas, but also some of our greatest constituents are housed in prisons in Texas.
We're here for the plant, we're here for the people of the plant, and there's a lot of people that are still hemmed up over the plant. So if Last Prisoner Project's on the path to getting them out, we're in support.
We're making so much progress, but unfortunately, there are so many people that are still behind bars.
And when they start putting you away for something like cannabis and nonviolent activity, it's pretty sorry.
We got to change that.
This year, they are teaming up to salute the work of the Last Prisoner Project. This week, that group celebrated the release of another convicted nonviolent cannabis criminal out of jail. Claudio Martinez Jr. was in a federal prison in Texas for 11 years of a 21-year sentence that they received in 2016. The Last Prisoner Project had worked on getting him out of jail, and when President Biden pardoned federal prisoners for low-level cannabis crimes, it was time for Martinez to be set free. That happened this week. You can add Arizona into the billion-dollar cannabis states. Karen Black has that story, plus a lawsuit involving some of the biggest industry names based in that state.
I'm Karen Black from Green Finger Consulting with the Arizona Cannabis Report for Cannabis Coast to Coast News. Arizona's cannabis industry is at the center of a major antitrust lawsuit. Earth's Healing in Tucson has filed a class action suit against a Chinese vape manufacturer for unspecified damages. The retailer alleges the Shenzhen S'more Technology Company, known for its C-cell vaporizers, has operated an illegal monopoly since 2016. Several of S'more's U.S. distributors are also accused of colluding to control prices and eliminate competition. One of those distributors is Jupiter Research, based in Tempe, Arizona, and Jupiter is a subsidiary of Phoenix's Tilt Holdings. The case could have significant implications for Arizona's cannabis supply chain and pricing structures. As for sales figures, Arizona made it into the billion-dollar cannabis club again in 2024, but just barely. Preliminary total sales of $1.13 billion is down $245 million from 2023. And more declines this year as January sales dropped 20% year over year to $87 million, and the average item price fell 8%. On the legislative front, 2 more cannabis bills were introduced before the deadline, bringing the total number of marijuana measures to 12 this session. A new House bill would require water conservation plans for cannabis, just like every other crop in the state. It also introduces a 30,000 square foot canopy limit per licensee. The other new bill aims to protect tenants from eviction solely for cannabis use. A similar measure made it nowhere last year. 2 other marijuana bills made progress this past week. A measure to allocate $25 million for cannabis research is advancing in the Senate despite funding concerns. And a controversial bill that would restrict cannabis advertising, including ads that appeal to children, passed the House. Its broad definition of marijuana could significantly impact the consumer hemp industry. Opponents hope to refine the bill's language to address this issue while maintaining the advertising restrictions. That's all for this week's Arizona Report. I'm Karen Black from Greenfinger Consulting reporting for Cannabis Coast to Coast News.
That'll do it for the A Block, our first section of Cannabis Coast to Coast News. When we come back, we will have our international reports from Europe and Canada, plus we'll check in with our Cologne guy from Chicago. Cannabis Coast to Coast News continues after this break.
Just outside of Chicago, Illinois. For Cannabis Coast to Coast News, thanks for tuning in.
Ready to take your craft to the next level? Imagine faster extractions, purer products, and more profits. Sounds good, right? At Pure 5 Extraction, we've revolutionized cannabis extraction with our game-changing technology. No solvents, no heat, just the cleanest, most natural process on the market. Whether you're a boutique grower or a large-scale operation, Pure 5 has the tools to elevate your business worldwide. Visit pure5extraction.com today. Pure 5 Extraction, because your plants deserve the best.
What if we're right? What if all of a sudden they discovered that there is medical use for marijuana and that it is good for you and it's better than alcohol and it's better than opioids and it helps your health? What if we're right? What if they find that out?
Specific cannabinoids have medical value. These are facts.
I'm here today in hopes to assist in removing the demonized stigma of cannabis and the perception that cannabis is just about getting high. The true base of this plant has to be known.
I don't think anybody should ever go to jail for cannabis. Get some medicine, and everybody should have access to it.
This is something which, at the very, very least, is the key to alleviating suffering and extending life for millions of human beings. Right? For returning some kind of balance to our society, and quite possibly of restoring our planet's natural balance as well.
Welcome back to Cannabis Coast to Coast News. I'm Alaina Pinto. Before we get back to our roundup of state reports from here in the United States, there's a lot going on around the world. Perhaps the most interesting development this week comes from the South American country of Colombia, where for decades the cartels down there controlled the market traffic and in some cases the government. Now the head of the government in Colombia, President Gustavo Petro, is asking his Congress to legalize the plant medicine to decrease the violence that has accompanied that enterprise for years. Cannabis in Colombia has been legal for medicinal purposes since 2016 and industrial purposes since 2021. For adult use, cannabis has been decriminalized for home grow, possession, and consumption since 1994. Now it's time to move, though, from South America to Europe, where Ben Stevens reports on the progress of Switzerland's launch of their adult use market.
I'm Ben Stevens with Business of Cannabis with this week's European Cannabis update for Cannabis Coast to Coast News. The preliminary results for Switzerland's pioneering adult use cannabis trials have been published by the University of Lausanne in conjunction with the University of Applied Sciences Northwestern Switzerland, showing promising early results. 7 such trials are taking place across Switzerland, with the first beginning in 2023 and around 7,000 participants currently involved. These allow for small-scale legalization of the sale of cannabis for recreational purposes, with a view to studying how different sales methods impact public health and consumption. Flying in the face of arguments that legalization threatens public health, the early findings suggest that if there is a change in consumption patterns, it is established in the direction of lower-risk consumption methods like vaping. Furthermore, despite concerns about adverse social impacts on the communities where the trials are taking place, no disturbance of public order was observed around the points of sale, and no leakage of the cannabis from the trials into the illicit market was observed. With a full report expected in the coming months, the early signs paint an optimistic picture for Switzerland's recently announced full adult use legalization project, with these pilot trials aimed at establishing a model for the best possible framework to sell cannabis for recreational purposes. Meanwhile, in the UK, long-running efforts to become the first country in Europe to fully regulate CBD products have finally made some meaningful progress. The Food Standards Agency, which is overseeing the novel foods approval process for thousands of CBD products, has finally put another 5 applications through to the final stage since the start of the year, nearly double the total number approved in 2024. However, this process also comes with setbacks. The FSA has recently removed over 100 products from the public list, which allows products already on the market to remain on sale without full approval, meaning they are now ineligible to stay on the market. Businesses remain frustrated at the length of the process and the severe restrictions put on both THC content and the proposed acceptable daily intake of CBD with these products. That's all for this week's European Cannabis Report. I'm Ben Stevens with Business of Cannabis, reporting for Cannabis Coast to Coast News.
One nation that continues its fledgling export business to Europe is Canada. That's where Debi Facey reports from every week.
This is Debi Facey with your Canadian Coast to Coast Cannabis News Report. So what we have in Canada this week is the new regulations are going to be launched on March 12th, which is going to be including new laws surrounding the packaging that we have here in Canada, which is now going to be see-through for any dried cannabis. Also, we're going to be able to have the microcultivation growth be able to utilize now 800 meters versus the smaller 200 meters that they were having to work with. This is going to be something that's going to be great for our industry, especially due to the fact that many of our products consumers can't see, know, or even be aware of what they're going to be smoking, and this way just ensures way more accountability on both parties. Next story is we have the growth in pre-rolls here in Canada. Pre-rolls have seen a leap compared to the edibles and just overall dried flower categories, and this is due to the fact that they are a much easier way to consume, easier way to hide, as well as they have made them very, very, very affordable in some cases, which is great for many of the consumers that just like to toke and go. This is Debi Facey with your Canadian Coast to Coast Cannabis News Report. Peace.
Back here in the United States, we have 3 stories from California. Last week, the 2024 annual report by the Department of Cannabis Control was released. In that report, the size of the #1 revenue-producing state in the country had a little trouble with recalls of products. In fact, there were 63 recalls of 259 different products. One good factoid from that report is the fact that legal cannabis production increased by double digits. That increase was just under 12% to 1.4 million pounds in 2024, which is good. However, when you consider that the illicit market was estimated to be 11.4 million pounds, you understand that the impact of the legal grows and production still pales in comparison. Of course, no one knows the exact amount of legacy market cannabis California still ships out of the state, but there is still plenty of room for a shift once California figures out the right formula to increase the legal market and shrink the illegal one. One more business note from California. Safe Harbor Financial, that had been moving towards receivership, received some bailout help from the Colorado Credit Union, which reduced some of their debt in order to keep them operational. Now let's check in with Marianne Cursetjee in Oregon.
I'm Marianne from Alibi with the Oregon Cannabis Report for Cannabis Coast to Coast News. A lawsuit has been filed by 2 Oregon cannabis businesses to overturn Measure 119, which requires a labor peace agreement for most cannabis businesses. The plaintiffs argue that the newly enacted law violates employers' free speech rights, and also that the state is preempted by the National Labor Relations Act. One question is whether the NLRA applies, as cannabis is illegal federally. Also, this week has been a terrible week for cannabis businesses in Portland. Data is still coming in, but rumors are that between 5 and 10 different businesses have been hit by a crew of smash and grab robberies. The Cannabis Industry Alliance of Oregon, CHOW, is meeting Monday night to discuss this crisis and share solutions. If you're in town, would love to have you attend. That's the Oregon Cannabis Report. I'm Marianne with Alibi for Cannabis Coast to Coast News.
In Illinois, one of the nation's largest multi-state operators, Ayr Wellness, is moving out. At the same time, they are putting more of an effort into increasing their footprint in Florida, an all-medical market. Ayr will be selling their 4 retail stores where they were never able to achieve scale or the vertical integration needed to compete. With more from Illinois, here's Mark Allen, our Chicago clone guy.
What's up, everybody? Mark Allen, the Chicago clone guy here with Bird, tuning in from just outside of Chicago, Illinois, for Cannabis Coast to Coast News. Thanks for tuning in. Lots going on here in Illinois, Chicagoland, as always. Unfortunately, not the greatest news, but in Richland County, Illinois, 2 parents decided to send their 5-year-old to school, kindergarten, with a bunch of cannabis, a bunch of cannabis concentrates, and some paraphernalia in their literally clear breakfast lunchbox. So the teachers saw all of it. They called the police. The police went to their house to arrest them, which I didn't really like that, even though it was very stupid. But then the police found meth. So these meth heads sent their kids to school with cannabis. Fortunately, I guess, luckily it wasn't a meth sandwich. But in other news, DuPage County, Illinois, good news, dismissed 19 cannabis DUIs because of the bad blood test results that we were talking about not too long ago. Try saying those words fast in a row. But that's great for DuPage County to dismiss those 19 DUI cases for cannabis. Thank you for doing that. Other interesting news, Mayor Johnson is in a battle with Governor Pritzker over, simply put, hemp and cannabis regulation. This is pretty interesting. Normally, they're on the same page, but Governor Johnson wants less regulation on hemp and Pritzker wants more, so they're kind of battling right now. So we're going to see how this heats up, because it's definitely heating up here, even though it's snowing outside, but figuratively it's heating up in Chicago. And it's my birthday today and it's snowing. Guess how old I am in the comments. One last thing to finish up this segment. Elgin, Illinois had over 10,000 reported exposure THC-related calls for cannabis that put people hospitalized and kind of messed people up. So long story short, because of all those calls, they banned THC edibles in Elgin, Illinois. Population of about 110,000 people. But that sums up the news for Chicago. I'm Mark Allen, the Chicago clone guy. This is Bird reporting for Cannabis Coast to Coast News.
Now let's check in with Tina Tasaka in Nevada and get an update on the emerging influence of the tribal nations in the cannabis industry.
I'm Tina Chisaka with 420 Technologies, and this is the Nevada and Tribal Nations Report for Cannabis Coast to Coast News. The Indigenous Cannabis Industry Association leadership is heading to Las Vegas for the RES 25 Economic Summit presented by the National Center for American Indian Enterprise Development, and they will champion the growth of Native participation in the cannabis and hemp industries. The event is comprised of tribal leaders, members of Congress, state and local officials, and CEOs on a national platform. After parties will take place one evening at tribally owned Nuwu Dispensary and Consumption Lounge in downtown Las Vegas. The conference is being held at Caesar's Palace March 10th through the 13th. I'll be there. There is fantastic humanitarian work in Las Vegas. Through the Las Vegas Chamber of Cannabis, I was informed about this amazing woman and executive director, Shauna McQueen, whose daily passion takes in donations and gives out donations, serving homeless communities in downtown and the tunnels. On any given night, they may pass out 100 hot meals, socks, batteries, 120 water bottles, canned goods, and more. They thrive from partners and donations. You can follow them on IG, Holy Smoke Vegas. They are a 501c nonprofit plus 100% volunteer-based. The Chamber of Cannabis is a supporter and sponsor. During a late February shooting investigation near I-11 and the 215 in Northwest Las Vegas, it led to an arrest of Christopher Christman on March 5th. While searching for a weapon, detectives found 41 pounds of illegal cannabis in his possession. Christman now faces multiple charges, including assault with a deadly weapon and possession charges. That's it for the Nevada highlights and tribal nations. I'm Tina Chisaka with 420 Technologies and Cannabis Coast to Coast News.
One of the biggest challenges in any legal cannabis market is dealing with the various compliance and regulations that every state has in place. Some, like here in Massachusetts, have some very unfair rules that they continue to perpetuate. For instance, you have to pay for different fees and licenses for the same business. Also, for instance, if you have a dispensary for adult use and want to get a medical license too, you have to pay separate fees for each dispensary location you are licensed to operate in. We'll have a more detailed report on the situation in the Bay State in our next block. But at least Massachusetts is not alone with issues with their regulatory bodies. Christopher Bright has the story of one such issue in Maryland. Here he is.
Welcome to Cannabis Coast to Coast News. I'm Christopher Bright from The Enlightened Voice, bringing you this week's top cannabis headlines. Renee Coleman, owner of Bud & Mary's LLC, is calling out Harford County's officials for delaying her dispensary's opening. She says she can't secure a location because the county's council won't give her the go-ahead. Coleman was awarded a state dispensary license in August of 2024. Maryland gives license holders 18 months to open, but the 6 months in, she says she's still stuck with nothing but a logo. I'm very, very worried, Coleman told WJZ. We've had no communication from the county council, and what am I supposed to do? Despite multiple attempts to meet with her officials, Coleman says she's been ignored. The county, however, claims its hands are tied. They proposed legislation to allow dispensaries, but the council voted it down, blocking permits. Coleman has already invested $20,000 and says this is unacceptable. We followed all of the rules and we just want to do what the law allows, she said. With no progress at the county level, Coleman's next move is to take the fight to the state. And this week's content creator is Gina from Quality Vibes Canna. Her inspiring rags to riches journey highlights the power of self-belief and hard work. She designs merchandise for Get to the Joint and Trappin' Manufacturing, as well as uniforms for many medical cannabis companies. Check out her amazing work on her Instagram at Quality Vibes Canna. And this has been this week's Maryland's Cannabis Report. I'm Christopher Bright, the Enlightened Voice, reporting for Cannabis Coast to Coast News.
That'll do it for the B block. We have our final section of this week's news coming up. In the C block, we will tell you about an unfair arrest of a beloved caregiver advocate in New Zealand who has busted last week and caused a countrywide protest. Cannabis Coast to Coast News continues after this.
It's a whole new world of weed out there, isn't it? Everyone is learning new ways to titrate, ingest, consume, imbibe, and engage with this plant medicine we call cannabis. Now, let me tell you my cannabis story. You know, I've had 4 major surgeries in the past 23 years and suffer from osteoarthritis with a variety of metal parts in my body and one on deck. Now, thanks to those chronic pain issues, I've been a medical patient in Massachusetts for almost 10 years now. I remember my first trip to a dispensary just outside of Boston, and I told the bud tender I didn't want to smoke it anymore. So I tried edibles, then tinctures, then vaping, and now if I'm going to smoke, I only use the Weejits filtration system. What? The Weejits.com, Weejits, that's weed, W-E-E-D, G-E-T-S.com, is where you'll find the planet's coolest product that cools the smoke from everyone's favorite flower. The guy that started this was a pretty good medical device manufacturer, and he created this maze pipe that cools the smoking process from 1300 degrees Fahrenheit upon inflammation down to just 90 degrees when it reaches your mouth. That's right, 1300 down to 90. That's why this maze pipe is amazing. Now, add in the code of PCM TV and you get 15% off. So just go to Weejits.com and check out the best way to enjoy a cooler smoke with less coughing and hacking and more peace of mind.
Welcome back to Cannabis Coast to Coast News. I'm Alaina Pinto. This is the C block, or final section of our weekly roundup of cannabis news from around the world. One final reminder to remember to scan the QR code to take you right to the App Store or Google Play and download the PCM TV app. Next up is Virginia, where they continue to put forth an effort to bring adult use to that state, despite knowing their governor, Glenn Youngkin, continues to defy the will of his constituents and will veto any pro-cannabis law that reaches his desk. But here's Joe Parsons in Virginia.
I'm Joe Parsons with the Virginia Cannabis Connection from Higher Education's Coffee Talk, sponsored by 97.5 3WV, and reporting for Cannabis Coast to Coast News. With all the big MSO companies that are currently in operation across America, there is one that really stands out. That's Green Thumb Industries. Not only are they doing rather well in Virginia, they are currently one of the most successful in the nation. GTI went public with their fourth quarter earnings, and unlike a lot of the other big MSO companies, they are thriving in an industry that is proven to be extremely difficult to achieve profitability and growth. They reported record high sales numbers in both medical and adult use markets. The chief executive officer and founder of GTI, Ben Kovler, was proud to report their growth progress and went on record to say demand for THC in America is at an all-time high, and Green Thumb is well positioned to deliver on this opportunity. Meanwhile, alcohol consumption trends in America are not positive, as the Surgeon General recently warned of the harms of alcohol and its link to cancer. In contrast, cannabis is enhancing the well-being of tens of millions across the nation. For their fourth quarter earning, they had over $294 million in revenue. Cash flow from operations reached over $195 million, and an additional $172 million in cash from repurchasing $43 million of company shares. In Virginia, they're a great business partner, and they represent the district where I live, that is HSA Health Service Area 3. They have shown to be most interested in the possible retail market in Virginia, as under current guidelines, they're only allowed to operate 6 total locations in the Commonwealth. An adult use market would allow for even more growth potential in the entire Commonwealth and not just one region. And I know that I personally wish them continued success. Well, that's going to do it from this week from Higher Education's Coffee Talk, sponsored by 97.5 3WV in Charlottesville, and reporting for Cannabis Coast to Coast News. I'm Joe Parsons. Until next time, stay lifted.
With all the doom and gloom coming from the industry, there are still some exceptions to the downturn in fortunes. Take Massachusetts-based multi-state operator MariMed. They are expanding and growing at a slow, controlled, healthy, and profitable manner. This week, they closed on an $11 million deal for a Delaware-based company. Here's Doug Miller, who is high on Wall Street and has some more insights on MariMed.
I'm Doug Miller from High on Wall Street with this week's Cannabis Stock Report for Cannabis Coast to Coast News. MSO MariMed has closed on its $11 million acquisition of First State Compassion Center in Delaware. The deal was made in July of 2023 and includes 2 medical cannabis dispensaries as well as cultivation and processing facilities. The FSCC acquisition adds to MariMed's ongoing roll-up strategy, which included acquisitions in Maryland, Massachusetts, and Illinois. So let's see how MariMed's stock chart looks. It's trading around 11 cents, and it's been pulling back, so keep an eye on it for that bottom so it can reverse back up. And be sure to trade smart and lock in those profits. The entire market's been a little choppy lately, so you have to trade them very, very smart right now. And that's this week's Cannabis Stock Report. Reporting for Cannabis Coast to Coast News, I'm Doug Miller.
In other news from Massachusetts, there's a retailer who owes the state over $420,000 in state taxes. Rebel, with 2 locations in Great Barrington and Boston, is challenging those controversial host community fees of 3%. Many cities and towns across the Commonwealth want those cities and towns to actually explain why those fees exist. They even have the nerve to ask the courts to ask city officials what they are doing with them. It's happened a number of times in the state, and some more friendly cities and towns are even eliminating them since they either don't want to account for what they are doing with those fees or they're using them for non-cannabis related businesses and activities. Another issue in the Bay State is the decline of the medical market. The Department of Health was originally overseeing the entire medicinal marijuana program from 2013 to 2018. When the Cannabis Control Commission was created after adult use was voted in by the voters in 2016, the rules changed for the medical market, and fewer and fewer people signed up for that program. So now that figure is down to just 90,000 patients. But compare that to a medical-only state like Florida, where there are over 860,000 registered patients. ACS of West Bridgewater and Hull are now going to be dual licensed dispensaries after both towns allowed them to apply for an adult use license in addition to the medical only license they've been operating under since 2018. And now ACS is waiting for the Cannabis Control Commission to give them the green light to open their Hull location for adult use. Alan Casper is an outreach coordinator for ACS and explains how challenging it is to deal with the CCC and some of the regulations of operating a legal compliant business.
It's clear medical places are closing. It's clear that it's incredibly expensive to be medical as opposed to adult use. The number of adult use that have cropped up everywhere has made it even harder to compete. And also with the lab fraud, people, are just pouring sometimes contaminated, cheap product onto the market. So it's very hard to compete if you're, a vertically integrated, very compliant, very patient-oriented, concerned about quality dispensary.
In New York, there is a new type of license in that state that's going to interest plenty of companies that manufacture unique products who want to white label their products in the Empire State. So there's now a new license available called the Type 3 Branding License. This will allow out-of-state operators to get their products into one of the fastest growing markets in the country. When it comes to New York, one attorney has carved out a niche for his live show called Ask Me Anything About Cannabis. It's on Wednesdays. His name is Jeffrey Hoffman, and you can check him out on LinkedIn live at 4:20 p.m. Our New York correspondent is Pam Schmiel, and she talked with Jeff this week and, of course, asked him anything.
This is Cannabis Coast to Coast News. I'm Pam Schmiel reporting from New York. Today we have Jeffrey Hoffman with us, a cannabis lawyer from New York, and he's going to talk to us about New York State's cannabis medical participation and how it's been declining and becoming an afterthought for lawmakers. Next week, medical advocates will rally in Albany on Tuesday, the state's capital, to push for changes to strengthen the program. Welcome, Jeffrey.
Thank you for having me.
Can you just tell us a little bit about the main goals of the rally in Albany next week and what you're hoping to accomplish?
Sure. So as often the case in every state that eventually goes adult use, the medical program becomes the bastard stepchild of cannabis in that state. We've seen declining numbers in New York's medical cannabis program. I think at the high water mark, there are about 150,000 folks with medical cards, and it's down closer to about 100,000 now. So we have several bills in front of the legislature that we're hoping that they will turn into law. 3 of them that we're going to be focusing on at our Medical Cannabis Lobby Day on Tuesday, March 11th. 2 of them are sponsored by the majority leader in the Assembly, Assemblymember Crystal Peoples-Stokes, one of which would require the medical health insurance providers that are completely funded by the state. These are entities like Workers' Comp and Epic. It would require them to cover medical cannabis as part of their offering, right? Right now in the state of New York, medical cannabis patients are pretty much entirely responsible for the cost of their medicine. We're not talking about the Aetnas or the Blue Crosses of the world. We do not expect them to get involved in this until federal legalization occurs. But in every state, there are a variety of state-funded health insurance entities. And of course, if they're funded by the state can require what it is that they cover. So the first bill that we're going to be promoting, it is one of the majority leader's bills, and it would require these state-funded health insurance entities here in New York to cover medical cannabis. The other bill that we will be focusing on that is sponsored by the majority leader would get rid of the medical cannabis excise tax here in New York. Best practice generally is that you do not make patients pay taxes on their medicine. Absurdly, that is something that many states do for medical cannabis. So this is really a very straightforward bill. We didn't even really create a dossier about it. It simply is the medical excise tax that exists currently, or medical cannabis excise tax that currently exists in New York. We eliminate it, right? So even if we don't get the health insurance bill, at least we can do something to help reduce the cost of the patient's medical cannabis. The third bill that we are working on, and this is a bill that I actually wrote in conjunction with Assemblymember Kellis, is for the creation of an endocannabinoid system awareness program in the state of New York. The vast majority of medical professionals in the United States were not taught about the endocannabinoid system in their medical training. Our numbers show only somewhere between 10 to 15% of medical schools teach about this. And this is a fundamental bodily system. Every vertebrae has one, right? So us, bears, dogs, cats, any animal that has a vertebrae, basically a backbone, has an endocannabinoid system. This is where the molecules of THC bind in your body. They're concentrated in your head and in your groin, where all good things are concentrated in your body. And this would create an awareness program about this system. It would provide education for all medical professionals. And we are going to do an enhancement to it that would make it part of the training that a doctor would have to take in order to be able to recommend a medical cannabis card, right? So this is not even a cannabis issue. This is a health issue. Now that cannabis is legal, you're going to have more and more people that are willing to speak to their doctor about it, more and more people that are going to present to medical professionals, either currently on cannabis or having taken cannabis in the recent past. And so this is a health issue, and we got to make sure all medical professionals have these educational resources. And those are the 3 bills that we will be promoting at our big press event on the $1 Million Staircase, which is where everybody does their press events in the Capitol in Albany on Tuesday.
Does insurance cover it in other states? And
No, this would be the first
we're trying to
passed
do this.
legislation that had that. That's right. There's other states that are attempting to do it. New Jersey is actively trying to do this as well, but whoever does it first will be the first.
This is Cannabis Coast to Coast News. I'm Pam Schmiel reporting from New York.
This is, of course, National Women's History Month, and women continue to carve out a leadership role in the cannabis industry. There are women's specific trade shows, brands like Buy Weed from Women, growers from Humboldt County in California to Maine, and Kimmy Cannabis from Oklahoma brings attention to some other female superstars in the industry.
I am Kimmy Cannabis from Can I Talk About It with the Oklahoma Cannabis Report for Cannabis Coast to Coast News. Women are trailblazing in Oklahoma's cannabis industry, proving that this agriculture field is a space where they can build generational wealth for their families. From cultivation to advocacy, women are shaping the future of cannabis in business, health, and social change. Oklahoma women in cannabis are not just entrepreneurs. They are advocates for mental health and wellness, pushing back against outdated stoner culture stereotypes. Some, like Ebony Jones, one of Oklahoma's few cannabis-friendly ordained ministers, are even bridging the gap between cannabis and religion, a topic often met with controversy. The conversation around mothers in cannabis is also evolving. More women are speaking out about the effects of cannabis on expecting mothers and its role in helping women battle postpartum depression while managing the everyday highs and lows of motherhood. But the journey isn't without challenges. Misogyny and patriarchy remain deeply embedded in the industry. Laura Thorne highlights this reality, revealing she holds countless unsolicited messages and photos from men in the business. Mary Jane Porter adds, I can't even tell you the gross things I've experienced in this industry. But women staying strong and true to our personal and company missions are the ones on top. As Oklahoma's cannabis industry grows, so does the role of women in shaping the future. They are not just participants, they are leaders, educators, and change makers, ensuring cannabis remains a path to empowerment. That is it for this week's Oklahoma Cannabis Update. I'm Kimmy Cannabis with Cannabis Coast to Coast News. Peace, love, and all that good stuff.
And finally tonight, the story of a 66-year-old man in New Zealand called Gandalf. His real name is Paul Smith, and he is a caregiver in that country. A caregiver is a term for those who grow and share their product with medical patients who otherwise do not have access to the plant. This week, law enforcement in New Zealand raided the rural Northland property where Gandalf grew his medicine for others. These caregivers are called green fairies in that country, and they have existed in this role since medical cannabis was allowed in 2020. Unfortunately, many of the most needy patients need access to plant outside of the fees to find a doctor and prescribe the medicine, which is how that program is set up. Gandalf is now facing charges that could end up with an 8-year prison sentence. Protests have popped up in that country since the arrest, and now this case will move into the court system there. So while we all may complain about the rules, regulations, and taxes that croak the business, some countries are far worse than what is going on here in the United States. That'll do it for this week's Cannabis Coast to Coast News. I'm Alaina Pinto. Remember, it's a whole new world of weed out there. Consume it responsibly, and we'll see you next week.
I think I messed up. Did you know there's a place that covers all the cannabis news you need? Welcome to Pro Cannabis Media, your go-to for all things cannabis. PCM is the CNBC of weed, bringing you the latest news and talk shows with a twist. We've got 16 state correspondents and multimedia journalists from around the US and Canada.
Hey everybody, it's Brandon Jones with Be Green Distribution with the Missouri Cannabis Report.
I'm Karen Black from Green Finger Consulting with the Arizona Cannabis Report.
I'm Amy Carter from Michigan Weedsters.
Andrew Behringer here reporting from Washington, D.C.
Debi Facey with the Canadian Toke of the Week.
It all started back in 2018 when founder Jimmy Young kicked off the In the Weeds podcast. His mission? Documenting the fight to end cannabis prohibition. Fast forward to today and we've got Cannabis Coast to Coast with Alaina Pinto, delivering the nation's only TV-style cannabis news show.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to another edition of Cannabis Coast to Coast, PCM TV's weekly roundup of industry news from California to New York. I'm Alaina Pinto.
As of August 2024, PCM has racked up over 1.2 million views and 14.5 million impressions on our YouTube channel. With 15,000 subscribers and growing, our reach is spreading like wildfire. PCM's website, YouTube, Rumble, Discord, Roku, Twitch, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Apple Podcasts, and even our very own PCM TV app. Get your cannabis news fix with Pro Cannabis Media. We're here to keep you informed and entertained. Stay tuned and stay lifted.